rules to order. First item on the agenda is to review and approve the minutes of December 1st. Before that happens, we're going to go around the table and introduce ourselves. And I'm going to ask Vice Chair Squirrel to once again chair this meeting. Senator Bray.
Good morning. My name is Chris Bray, one of the two senators from Addison Senate District, and I live in Bristol, Vermont.
And I'm representing Mark Higley. I live in Lowell, and I currently represent Lowell, J. Westfield, Troy, in the town of Eden. In my new district, I pick up Irisburg, Coventry, and Newport Town. It's a 2-seat district.
Representative Seth Bongartz. I represent Bennington 4, Arlington, Manchester, Sandgate, and a sliver of Sunderland. Which, you know, I actually am not sure where the line is because it actually doesn't matter because all of us that have Sunderland treat the whole thing as our district and do whatever. So,
Boy, what a territorial group.
I do not know exactly where the line is. I will have to do the rest.
So good morning. I'm State Senator Joe Benning, presently from the Caledonia County Senatorial District, soon to be blown up to smithereens. My town will become part of the Essex Senatorial District. And I won't be senator anyway because I'm leaving after.
Good morning, Representative Trevor Squirrel, representing Underhill and Jericho. Senator Lyons.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Is it okay to go ahead, Senator McDonald? Okay. Good morning, Senator Ginny Lyons, representing Chittenden County, Chittenden District, soon to change, but right now, all of Chittenden District. Thank you.
My name is Mark McDonald, and I represent Orange County, with exception of several towns at the Four Corners, which have been picked off and are parts of other districts at this time. And now I would turn the meeting over to Representative Squirrel.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. I'd like to let you know that Representative Carol Odie sends regrets. She tested positive for COVID this morning, not feeling well, and probably will not be joining us either on Zoom. And would also like to recognize our wonderful staff.
Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel.
Charlene Dindo, Committee Assistant.
All right, thank you. And the other thing you can see in here, they've decided to remodel our room here. So the witnesses are going to be way down there. But actually what we'll do is we'll ask them to get as close as possible when it's time for witnesses. First order of, I got my agenda. Approve the minutes of December 1, 2022. Representative Bongartz.
Yes. Oh, yes. That was a motion.
So moved.
I so moved.
Okay. All right, any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. First rule today is 22 P06, Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Vermont Regulation for Control of Pesticides. We have David Huber and Brian Redman on the list. David?
Morning, members of LCAR.
Morning.
Yeah, would you like me to sit closer to you guys or?
Yeah. Feel free to move up a little bit. You don't need to sit at the end.
Sure.
Or just yell. Yes.
Yeah. It looks like Brian is on the video screen. I'll introduce myself as well as everyone up here with me a little earlier than last time. Nice to see you all again. It's been 2 weeks. My name is Dave Huber, Deputy Director of the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. A lot of words. With me is Director Steve Dwinell.
Speaking now, Director of Farm.
Zach Schakowsky, Agricultural Resource Management Specialist.
And coming in live is Brian Redmond with Vermont DEC.
Hi, yes, good morning. Thank you. My name is Brian Redmond. I'm the Director for the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Division at DEC.
Welcome.
Thank you. Just wanted to say thank you very much for allowing us to come back today. We had a dual granting of extensions last time, so thank you very much. We definitely do appreciate the process and procedure. I just want to go over the main takeaways of this rule once again. This rule is improved regulation. It's the pesticide regulation, the main pesticide regulation for Vermont Agency of Agriculture. It involves certification and training and pesticide use. This is very much modernized from the 1991 regulations. Any improvement is a great improvement. And additionally, this language incorporates language from the 2017 Pollinator Protection Committee's report. One more thing to note is that this language in this rule that you have before you also incorporates consistency in its language, thanks to Director Redmond and his staff and their legal staff. We met several times and have incorporated isolation distances that were requested right before we met last time. And so our rule is now very consistent with two rules from DEC, namely the groundwater supply rule and the wastewater and potable water supply rule. Last time that we spoke, I gave more of a rundown of the rule. Since that time, we have updated the language, as I said, with Director Redmond's help. And we have also submitted that language to members of LCAR. We have submitted a letter explaining what was changed. We've also submitted a letter on behalf of DEC from Director Redmond expressing support for the rule with this incorporated language. The agency requests that LCAR move favorably on this rule.
Any questions for these guys, or do we want to hear from DEC first and then offer questions after that? Okay. Mr. Redmond, would you like to speak to some of the comments or suggestions you've made to changes to the rule?
Sure. Thank you, Vice Chair Squirrel. As Mr. Huber said, we worked, first of all, we appreciated the extra time to work through some of these issues that we identified with the pesticide regulations. We worked over the course of the last 2 weeks with the Agency of Agriculture. It was a collaborative effort. At the end of the day, we came to an agreement, and the extra time allowed us to achieve consistency with our regulations. The two primary areas that we were looking at in terms of the scope of what we were reviewing were the definitions, to make sure that the definitions used in the pesticide regulations are consistent with our regulatory definitions in two different rules. The first being Chapter 1 of the Environmental Protection Rules. It's the wastewater system and potable water supply rules, with emphasis added on the potable water supply part of that, and our Chapter 21 Environmental Protection Regulations related to public water systems. So those are the two main regulatory areas that we looked at. The conversations, like I said, were collaborative, and at the end of the time of our meetings, we came to an agreement that to bring both the definitions and the isolation distances consistent with the requirements in our rules. So with those changes, the DEC can offer support in the adoption of these regulations at this point.
Okay, thank you. I turn to the committee now for questions.
So, Mr. Redmond, I think my question probably goes to Mr. Redmond. Are there, so I appreciate that both agencies got together and did more work to help us sort things out that emerged in our last LCAR meeting. The question I come to this meeting with is, are there additional outstanding issues that need to be addressed and before we consider an approval of the rule? So that's a genuine question. My impression is that there are other issues, and so I would like to pause and ask, are there, well, I guess do two questions. Advocates, I don't know, have had a chance to see sort of the mature package that we're looking at today and weigh in. So we're on that short cycle when we get something and it's 2 days before we're meeting. It's hard to hear from advocates who are trying to sort out how many things we've resolved and how many we've left unresolved. So I have that question. But from A&R's point of view, are there other issues that, and then given more time, you feel you could profitably work on to further improve the functionality of the rule? And I'll say that within the context of, as Mr. Huber's pointed out, we have not changed this rule for a long time. So given my experience so far around state government, if we take something up, it may be quite a while again till we take it back up again. So I'm wondering if this is a time to slow down and spend a little more time working to make for a better rule before we move forward.
Thank you for the question, Senator Bray. It's a good question. I guess the way that I would respond to it is our DEC's review was relatively limited to what the existing rule had within its contents. So we were really focused in on those two areas that I've already mentioned, the definitions, to make sure that the definitions used in the pesticide regulations are consistent with those used in DEC's rules, and the isolation distances. So our focus was to make sure that the requirements relating to really isolation distances were consistent. So I think that for us was the major aspect to our review and the scope of our review. And I feel like we're in a good place with achieving consistency in that area that really afforded in better protections for drinking water sources, both potable water supplies and public water systems. So we feel good about the outcome here. So I don't know if that necessarily gets to your question, but that's kind of what the scope of our review entailed.
Okay. Did DEC review we received a letter back on November 30th from the Lake Champlain Committee et al. With a list of concerns with the rule as being offered at that point in time. So there's been some changes, as you just noted, but given that you have the lead role in environmental protections for the state of Vermont, I don't know if you reviewed that memo and have a response to those concerns. They may not be addressed specifically in this rule yet, but I'm wondering the degree to which they may be important to address if we're addressing, if we're writing and considering approving a rule. So.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I have not reviewed the letter from November 30th. So I'm not sure as to the issues that are identified in the letter. The other piece in terms of my responsibilities at DEC is the management of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Division. So my focus from a regulatory standpoint is really on drinking water supplies and soil-based wastewater systems. So if there are issues identified outside of that scope, that necessarily would not be me to speak to those issues. But I have not reviewed the contents of the letter, so I can't really comment on it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Director Redmond. Senator, I just wanted to give the committee some more information. I spoke to it briefly at the end of our 2-hour session last time. Just for timeline purposes, we at the Agency of Agriculture were prepared to submit the rule to the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules, LCAR, back in February of 2022. We received an email from Catherine Gessing over at Agency of Natural Resources just 3 days prior to submitting, asking to review the rule. We pushed our hearing at LCAR back until March by 1 month, which then set us down this procedure and process where we had to ask for an extension at the last time that we met. DEC as a whole was provided the ability to review our rule. We received comments from most of A&R, and we took those comments into consideration, and we only presented at LCAR once we had finally discussed fully with the Agency of Natural Resources. We were not made aware of this until the very last minute here, and we are finding ourselves now 2 weeks past the last LCAR hearing where we did take into consideration further comments from Department of Environmental Conservation. We certainly respect process, and we also very much respect our sister agencies and want to get their input. The Agency of Agriculture definitely feels as if we have done so the entire time. We have been very fair, and we have taken 2 pauses on this rule to make sure that we're getting the information from Agency of Natural Resources. And I think you're hearing now from Director Redmond that his review is complete. With respect to the November 30th letter from some of the advocates, the environmental advocates, I think that we have responded to their concerns during the main public comment session, which was in June of this past year. And we're more than happy to discuss further, but I think before you today is whether or not this rule can go forward and be approved.
If I may, I noticed that one of the representatives of the advocates listed in this letter that Senator Bray is speaking to is in the room, Mr. Carpenter. Would you like to respond?
Sure.
But there's a procedural thing I need to do here. I'm making the ask, but I need permission of the committee to ask Mr. Carpenter to speak since he's not on the agenda. So I'm looking for a motion.
So moved.
Okay. Any conversation, discussion? All those in favor of allowing Mr. Carpenter to speak, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Mr. Carpenter.
It's definitely a longer table than last time I sat down.
You're getting smaller.
Speak louder.
Yes, I'll try to do my best to project. For the record, Jared Carpenter representing the Lake Champlain Committee. And also our organization was one of those referenced by Senator Bray that submitted extensive comments to the agency about the draft rule. Other organizations, as you know, Conservation Law Foundation, Sierra Club, VPIRG, I don't know some out. But at any rate, Mason Overstreet and Chris from CLF testified last year. They are much more well-versed in the intricacies of this rule than I am, although I was involved in drafting comments. As you all know, we've had both policy issues with this and process issues with this. Policy issues are something that we disagree with, in various areas, and aren't necessarily the purview of LCAR, but certainly things that could be taken up by a consideration afterwards. In terms of process, we thought some of the public participation was limited, even though, yes, we did have an opportunity to make public comments, but not particularly engage with the agency throughout the process. And as Senator Bray referenced, this is a first time since 1991 since this rule was updated. There are currently other more minor rules, such as dealing with neonics and treated article seeds that the agency is required to produce best management practices and produce to the communities on agriculture. I want to say in January of 2024, but I might be March. Thank you. I might be mistaken. I was involved in discussion of that bill before those committees. So there will be an opportunity to speak to treated article seeds, but there might very well not be another opportunity to talk about some of these issues for another 30 years. We'd like to make sure that we get it right the first time and have the opportunity to continue discussion where discussion is needed. In some regards, we thought there was a lack of transparency. I think that the issue between A&R and AAFM right now in terms of the drinking water was sort of reflective of that process, that it sort of popped up and everything seems to be consistent now, but we haven't particularly had a chance to review it. That's not to say maybe it should be more stringent at the A&R rule because we're dealing with what's termed economic poisons. So we would like the opportunity to continue discussion in some areas, if possible. So otherwise, I suppose, or also, I suppose, committees of jurisdiction could take up some of these issues in the coming session and discuss them. I know one concern we really had was PFAS and pesticides, and that is an emerging issue. I know Senator Lyons' committee has been considering that issue for a couple of years. I know it's emerging. I know that there's differences of opinion on it. I know we're waiting for an EPA rule. I know, there are things, but that does not to say the state of Vermont can't get ahead of the issue as well. So the opportunity to continue discussion in some areas would be great. But obviously things are at the decision point of where the committee would like to go. Approving the rule, delaying approval of the rule, or rejecting it and saying
Committee questions? Oh, please.
Steve Doynell, the Director of Farm. I understand that it's been 30 years since the rule was changed. It's highly, highly unlikely that we're not going to be doing more rulemaking over the next few years. Like you said, we have the treated article seed, the information. We're going to have PFAS to deal with that we're getting the information for now. And, having been involved in other regulatory programs in the states, we're not going to go 30 years for another rule. It just can't be done. And I don't know why it took this long to get this rule to where it is now. But we need to address a whole host of emerging issues. The state of regulation of pesticides is changing all the time. EPA is enacting new policies regarding Endangered Species Act protections. That's ongoing right now. I happen to be on a committee with the Association of American Pesticide Control Officials to review those. They're just, there are a lot of issues going on there. The bulk of this rule, updating the certification and training requirements, is something that's very, very long overdue. And it would be, I don't want to use the word tragic, but it would be a shame if that rule, if we can't adopt those changes because they're so, obvious, and they haven't been the subject of any issues that I'm aware of from any of the advocates or any of the other agencies. It's pretty straightforward. There are things we need to do. We just need to get it done. But there are other areas, obviously, where we have some discussion. And, as the director, I can tell you, we are going to be doing more rulemaking. I mean, this is not the last time we're going to look at this rule. Rulemaking is going to be an ongoing activity in the area of pesticides. That's the simplest way to say it. So that's for your consideration.
Representative Hinckley.
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to ask our ledge council, my understanding is, and one of the suggestions is we reject the rule and head back to the beginning. I don't believe we have that authority, do we? And I guess I need to hear that from ledge council.
You do not have that authority. You can object to a rule, the agency can still adopt the rule, and it places what I call that scarlet red letter on the rule where it would shift the burden of the proof if there was a legal challenge going forward. But you cannot reject a rule and prevent the agency from adopting it.
Thank you.
Other committee members?
Senator Lyons.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the folks from AG and ANR for their work on this. I understand it's difficult after a 30-year period to go through and make the kinds of changes that you have recommended. I do have a couple of questions because I'm not on one of the committees, either of the committees of jurisdiction, but I noticed that there is now a division or a department of public health and agricultural resources. And I'm just asking how long that part of the agency has been around.
Thank you, Senator Lyons. What you're referencing is the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division. Historically, at the Agency of Agriculture, water quality, the Water Quality Division, and the pesticides, plant health industries, those were all under the general header of Agricultural Resource Management Division. We have several divisions over at the Agency of Agriculture. In Act 64 of 2015, the Vermont Clean Water Act, once we started expanding the RAPs as they're known now from the AAPs, it made sense to split those divisions, or the Ag Resource Management Division, into two separate divisions. One became Water Quality Division, the other one became the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division, which is comprised of pesticides, golf course permitting, ginseng regulation, apiary regulation, formerly or soon to be formally hemp regulation, and vector surveillance. We regularly correspond with and have memorandums of understanding with Agency of Natural Resources and with the Department of Health. We regulate activities by Vermont Transportation, VTrans, and we maintain relations with all agencies that we deal with. We also work very closely with the Water Quality Division, from which we once shared a division with.
So in this case, with the pesticide concerns that we've heard about and continue to hear about, do you have an MOU with the Department of Health to make decisions around public health implications of the application of and then the leachate from pesticide use, pesticides?
No, we do not, Senator Lyons.
And let me, then how do you make public health decisions?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, public health decisions relative to pesticides are made through a variety of means. We have close connections with U.S. District. We have a staff of toxicologists and environmental ecotoxicologists, and we use the data they evaluate ourselves when we can. There are drinking water standards for pesticides that have been established by EPA and by the Vermont Department of Health. And so we refer to those anytime we have an issue with a pesticide in a well or a groundwater. So yeah, I mean, it's part of a process that involves multiple agencies making decisions on on pretty much a pesticide by pesticide basis or a pesticide class basis.
Also, this is helpful, although we have heard during this discussion on these rules that DEC, ANR came in a little bit late, or I'm not sure how fully included. It's concerning to me that we continue to see silos around some of the decision making on pesticides and pesticide use, knowing that at least in one of the letters that we received, indication that since the 90s, there's been the goal of reducing pesticides and the use of pesticides, and yet that's increased over time. I don't, that could be related to the type of seed application that we're seeing and the pesticide included in seeds, and that's a problem in and of itself. But then if the goal is to reduce pesticide use, then we would also think we would have a reduction in pesticides in the water. I know this is a policy question, but I'm trying to get at how much testimony was taken during the development of the rules. So has ANR measured the level of pesticides in our drinking water over time? And was that data provided in the decision making on these rules? I guess that's a question for for Director Redmond, but it's also a question for you folks in ag.
Mr. Redmond, do you have a comment, response?
Sure. Thank you, Senator Lyons. As far as water supply regulation, there's a bit of a division in terms of the Chapter 1 and the Chapter 21 rules. So the Chapter 21 rules are our public water systems throughout the state. There's about 1,400 of those. And the Chapter 1 regulations are what we term as potable water supplies. Basically, those water supplies that are non-public, think of a homeowner with a well. And larger, anything that's non-public. Under public water supply regulations, Vermont is a primacy state, so we operate under the Safe Drinking Water Act in addition to some state level standards. So we have very robust data related to public, community, and non-transient, non-community public water systems for pesticides. There is routine monitoring that happens through public water supply regulation that generates those levels and that data for public water systems. For potable water supplies or non-public, the regulations that are applied to sort of quote standards for those are actually in our groundwater enforcement standards and our groundwater protection rule. That is a mix of EPA standards and health advisories that have been issued by the health department. And I'll let the Agency of Agriculture speak to this, but as soon as there's contamination that would be identified in a potable water supply, it turns into more of a site investigation, and ANR would be working collectively with Agency of Agriculture to sort of remedy those issues. There's no broad scale testing directed by ANR ongoing for potable water supplies. So there is no ongoing testing for pesticides in your own well. It's a homeowner's choice or the owner's choice. So I think that's how I would answer the standards question. In terms of our engagement with the health department, I can speak to that. We engage.
I guess my question is, what data was utilized in the development of the rules, and do we see a decline in the in pesticides in our groundwater or our potable or our other systems, our transient, intransient system, our community systems or others? Do we have that data available, since it was, I think there was a design back in the 90s to track that? And so how was it used to inform the rules? For me, it's not a trivial question, because it really suggests that the folks who have weighed in and provided testimony and information have some validity to what they're saying.
Yes, I understand what you're asking. I think it's probably best for the Agency of Agriculture at this point to provide a response in terms of how they're managing the pesticide use and monitoring levels in groundwater. We did not provide any we have a lot of data on public water systems for the state of Vermont, and that wasn't a data exercise that I came prepared to talk about today. So I think I would pass it over to Agency of Agriculture.
Thank you. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to understand how the rules were informed.
Excuse me, Carrie, I can never say your last name, so.
That's all right. It's Jaguar. Jaguar. And I'm sorry to butt in here, but Senator Lyons, you're fishing in the wrong hole for that data. We have run a surface and groundwater pesticide monitoring program since the early 80s. And so we do have that data set, and we do have an MOU with the Department of Health about what we do when we find a detection. For the last 20 years, those detections have primarily been nitrates. So when we see a nitrate detection, and forgive me, my vocabulary is lacking. It used to be a PAL, preventative action level, but the nomenclature has changed. So if we saw a detection level in the water that neared that PAL, we would work collaboratively with environmental toxicology folks at the health department, and we would do outreach together, the Agency of Ag and the Agency of, or the Department of Health. And if, not to bring up old names, but that was a program that Jeff Comstock ran and Gale Center. They partnered together and built that program. Patty Casey runs it now. And the woman who was at Health, Cecile Larson, is now with DEC. So there are a bunch of folks that deal collectively with detections of either nitrates or pesticides in groundwater, and those MOUs exist. And largely, we don't see pesticides. That's why you haven't really heard about it. And we're monitoring for the pesticides that are used the most in the environment. So primarily the corn herbicides, but there are other active ingredients that are on that screening list. And I'm sorry, I just wanted to also add the public health designation for the division was primarily added because to recognize that we're receiving a significant amount of CDC funding to do vector management for mosquitoes and ticks. And I know public health was capturing that because it is such a large division. Apologize for the confusion, and thank you for allowing me to speak up.
Can I ask one more quick question? So in terms of the measurement of pesticides use, which was intended to go down since the 90s, have we seen that decline?
We've seen change. From the 90s, yes. Like our actors, if you isolate any one compound, atrazine in particular was the primary. You've been in all the conversation about atrazine. Late 90s, we cut our atrazine use in half. A lot of the new chemistries that were developed, like the sulfonylureas and some of the other compounds that are corn herbicides, bring our pounds of usage down, but they are more active, so they're more toxic. So the pounds of active ingredient may not be the number that you're looking for, but we can say yes, that overall amount has gone down from the 90s, and it's been on a downward trend ever since. But the active ingredients we're not comparing apples to apples when you modify chemistries. And for instance, when we talk about insecticide use on corn, we've gone from organophosphate seed protectants to the neonics, and the neonics are used orders of magnitude less active ingredient than the organophosphates, but the impact may have gone the other way. So we're using less and seeing potentially more impact. So the way we measure that, you can make the data tell any story that you want, basically is what I'm saying. And we've seen that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sorry, I'll shut up here in a second, but the agency can make that data available. Patty Casey is our steward of all the monitoring data, and it's both surface and groundwater.
Thank you.
Speaking for the agency, sorry, Steve.
And it's okay. Before we go there, Michael Grady, are you still on?
Yes, I am.
And you had your hand up before, but then you went away. So I just want to give you the opportunity to speak if you still want to.
I think Carrie answered or
Okay.
provided all the information that I could have provided, or much more, actually.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. So 2 points. One is we do maintain records on our website of best site use in Vermont, collected from the records of the commercial applicators, the licensed applicators. And I just took a look at that this morning. And for example, imidacloprid, one of the neonics, being used about half of what it was in 2017. So one of the things that happened was that those materials were made restricted use products. So homeowners can't use them, only commercial applicators can use them. So we've got a pretty good handle on their use. And as far as the water, detection of pesticide water, I reviewed that data when I got here, and I did not see any exceedances of any of the health levels in the detections of the wells that we've sampled. They were all below a level of concern for toxicological reasons. We have occasional occurrences of some of the corn herbicides, like Carrie was saying, but they've always been below a level of concern. So that's information.
Additional questions, comments? Senator McDonald?
Folks who are listening in from the public are probably scratching their heads and asking what we're talking about here. My understanding is that these rules are designed, let me back up, that sometimes the federal government announces that a pesticide is harmful. And sometimes they say it should never be used. Sometimes they say it should only be used under certain circumstances. And these rules are designed to see that the recommendations are followed when the federal government says so. So I guess my question is, if we get a ruling or a notice from the federal government saying you should never use this stuff again, and we get it on Monday, when does it stop being used according to these rules?
Well, we have to take action as the agency to prohibit its use in the state. We do have the ability to classify products as state restricted use in addition to the federal restricted use. And, so we can do that almost immediately. And then we have control over who can use it. And we can certainly notify all the commercial applicators to stop the use. I mean, if it was that, most of the time when EPA is taking an action like that, there's a long lead time. There are many steps that they go through before they issue a notice like that. And Carrie, if you're still on, you might want to use the example of chlorpyrifos and how the state dealt with that, because that's a good example of exactly what you're talking about.
So I've oversimplified the question, was if you're notified on Monday, you shouldn't use this stuff. Or you should only use it under the following conditions with the following training. Could you tell us, if you're notified on Monday, will something stop on Tuesday or a week from Tuesday or next month or 6 months from now?
As soon as we can get the word out. I mean, Monday afternoon.
Done.
Yeah.
And if it can only be used with people who have been given additional training and under certain circumstances, it will stop on Tuesday until those people are trained and ready to go.
And like I say, Carrie has an example of that almost that exact situation with chlorpyrifos.
Gary?
Were you deferring to someone else too?
Yeah, I was asking Carrie to provide the example. This action had happened before I got here, so Carrie was in this chair when chlorpyrifos actions were taken.
Gary, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair McDonald. I guess the example of chlorpyrifos was set to be have their tolerances canceled by the federal government in 2016. The change of administration vacated that. So chlorpyrifos was continuing to be registered We believe that the EPA did their due diligence and the product should have been canceled. So in Vermont, we denied registration of all chlorpyrifos products. And we had chlorpyrifos discontinued in Vermont 4 years before the rest of the country caught up. The legislature has been very generous with authority to the pesticide program in Vermont. We are one of the only states that has the authority to regulate treated articles as pesticides. So, for instance, when EPA decided that CCA, the compound used to pressure treat lumber, was causing damage, it took EPA 15 years to get that out of the market. We do have authority granted from you to remove that instantly when we see a detrimental effect like that. So you have given us broad authority in Vermont to protect the citizens of the state.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm satisfied that if we're notified on Monday that steps will be taken on Tuesday to discontinue the use, et cetera, and that we have a record of doing that, and that these rules would continue that practice. My second question was that we have often in statute prohibited the sale of certain products in Vermont. And in the same statute, we have permitted those merchants who sell those products to continue to sell them until their shelves are empty and inventory has been sold. Are we to understand that such a practice is not part of the rule before us, and that if you have something on your shelf that is prohibited or whatever, that it will no longer be used, and there's no provision, no one is given the authority to extend the use of such a product until the inventories have been exhausted?
Am I still on the stand here?
Go ahead.
Senator McDonald, in any cancellation that comes down from the federal government, it's a negotiation generally, and there usually are existing stocks provision written into that cancellation. In Vermont, in coordination with our Attorney General, we can decide to let those existing stocks provisions play out or automatically deny registration of a product if we think it's so bad that we don't want to see it anymore. So we do have flexibility there. In general, in the case of PCNB, which is a golf course fungicide, that was discontinued nationally, and we let the existing stocks be used. So had we thought there was a better alternative or some other route of exposure, if that product could have gone back to the manufacturer, we don't want to create a scenario where we're creating hazardous waste and sending something through the waste stream. So we have authority to go either way, depending on the public health impact of the product. As we talked about last time, if we were to deem a product adulterated by a different set of chemistry, this is the PFAS case, we would stop sale that immediately as an adulterated product.
I'm splitting hairs here, but if the federal government deems it not to be used, we in Vermont can ask that same question of ourselves?
Absolutely, because we decide what gets used in Vermont. We have a registration process. If we revoke a registration at any time, that product can no longer be sold or used in the state. But that doesn't happen very often. There will be, at any product cancellation that comes through the Federal Register, there will be an existing stocks provision associated with that cancellation. And we can choose to observe it or deny registration here in the state. So in your case, if the case described about finding out something is very bad on Monday, we would go through a deliberation of whether or not that needed to be pulled from the shelf on Monday afternoon, or if the existing stocks provision laid out in the cancellation in the Federal Register were adequately protective of human health.
I'm trying to understand that if the federal government says you should not use this under at all, or only use it under certain circumstances, that the rule permits Vermont regulators to alter those recommendations?
So it's not in this rule, it's in our registration. It's in the registration rule. But yes, we can act faster than the federal government. It's outside of this rule, it's in our registration rule, but we do have that authority to be stricter than the federal government.
Do you have the authority to be more lax than the federal government?
No, we do not.
I find that heartening, and when I try and go through all the language to see where it says you may not be more lax than the federal government, I haven't found that, but then that's perhaps my shortcoming.
Senator, that we can provide you the letter that gives the agency primacy to regulate pesticide use, and that is spelled out in our agreement for primacy with the federal government. It's not necessarily part of the rule. It's if we were to be more lax than the federal government, they would revoke our primacy and take over jurisdiction of pesticide use.
You're saying the federal government would do that if it believed that we had not acted according to their directives?
That has never happened, but yes. It's never happened in any state. But if we are outside of the agreement of what we agreed to receive primacy, to get delegated primacy, then that primacy is at stake, is in jeopardy.
So you're reassuring us that we have pledged as a state to follow their direction.
It's slightly more than a pledge, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions or comments? Senator Bray.
So this is for Eden Stack or Mr. Jaguar, who may have been there at the creation of some of the things. But Mr. Jaguar, you were saying before that in response to Senator Lyon's question about the trend line for the use of pesticides or economic poisons, that we're seeing there's been a decline in overall volume, but you noted that some of the replacement chemicals, I think I heard you say, so I want to check in, that some of the replacement chemicals are stronger. So if you're doing just sort of a pound for pound comparison, it might not be very revealing. You'd really need to have something, I don't know what the right units would be, like basically a measure of toxicity included in order to adjust so that can you explain what we're doing in terms of, are we reducing the amount of toxic material in the environment, adjusting for the fact that some things are more toxic than others, and how many pounds or gallons you're using may not be a very revealing measure?
So Cornell has a program, it's called an environmental impact quotient, basically, and it really bolsters IPM. But yes, you Senator Bray, understood me. That was accurate. And I guess the example is atrazine at 3 pounds of active ingredient per acre is as effective as some of the sulfonylurea compounds at 1.5 ounces per acre. So you're getting the same weed control from one product at 3 pounds per acre as you are at something that's used at 1.5 ounces per acre. So the relative toxicities are different, and there's all sorts of tools that have been used to sort of look at that. And one in particular that we've used over the years is Cornell's environmental impact quotient. But you can't really look at the overall aggregate picture. You have to look at use patterns sliced out individually for it to make sense. It's a very granular level of review and analysis.
Okay. So I appreciate that nuance. If we go back to the policy level, 60,000 foot level, reducing exposures and reducing the introduction of toxins into the environment. I mean, I think that's the highest level thing I think we're after for in terms of making the environment a healthier place for every living thing in the state. So does that policy, is that expressed in this rule? I'm trying to make sure that the new rule achieves that policy goal. And I don't want us to sail right past each other in the night because we use the wrong measure or the wrong language in the wrong place. So I'm looking for some guidance as to whether or not we're on target in this rule to do that, achieve that policy goal.
It absolutely does, Senator. And some of that is in the specific the new permit programs that you're seeing. Without those new permit programs, the new permit programs that are offered in the new rule bring those areas under IPM that had previously not been under an IPM strategy. And if you couple that with sort of the creation of the Ag Innovation Board, that replaces the Pesticide Advisory Council, we're targeting more of the conversation at the Ag Innovation Board around IPM and agriculture. The Vermont Pesticide Advisory Council mostly concentrated on uses that were not agriculture. So golf courses, rights of way, and other mosquito control uses. Those are under IPM because of the permit programs that they're in. Couple this new rule with the creation of the Ag Innovation Board, and we'll be capturing exactly what you're looking to capture. And that's having conversations about ways to reduce impacts from ag use, which is previously not happened in a public setting.
Mr. Hoover?
Just to add one more thing to what Mr. Jaguar has already said in response to you, Senator. As we've made clear from the beginning, this rule is about certification and training. So we want at the agency to make sure that those who are applying pesticides are doing so in a safe manner, both to themselves, if that happens, as well as to the property and others, as well as the environment, to make sure that all Vermonters are safe, and to make sure that pesticides, when used as an option, are used in a safe, responsible, efficient manner.
Senator Bray.
And so to the agency, Mr. Jaguar, sort of a follow-up question around toxicity is the adequacy of our monitoring. We only know what something's there if we go testing for it. So I don't know if we look at the full range of chemicals available and in use in the state of Vermont, and we run sort of a full panel on occasion to assess them, or we're only chasing down nitrates because they're an issue around a particular family of fertilizers or something like that, you know? So can you say something about how this rule addresses of the scope of monitoring? And I guess the frequency would go hand in hand with that.
Yep, absolutely. So basically, we monitor specifically around distinct use patterns, and we use the reported usage data to determine what active ingredients we're looking for. So we're not looking for thousands of active ingredients in a screen. I don't have a lot of faith in those sort of like the USGS screen that just takes a snapshot and looks for chemistries, but doesn't actually quantify those chemistries based on a standard. So all of our monitoring programs, we're actually looking for something that we have a standard for, and we're screening. We use our usage data to determine what we're testing for, and we've tested around different use patterns. Like I said, the corn herbicides, which also includes all the neonic insecticides. So the suite of things that can be used on corn kernels, we are looking for in our corn herbicide, or in and around cornfields. We're looking for atrazine, mesotrione. I don't want to get into the chemistries. That just adds confusion to the conversation. But what we see used is what we're looking for. When we monitor on a right-of-way, utility right-of-way, or a railroad right-of-way, we're looking for what they were permitted to use. That said, if something else shows up, our instrumentation is sensitive enough to see a peak, and then we'll determine what that peak is. So we know what we're looking for, and we can find what we're looking for. But if there are other things in there, it'll take more research, but we will be able to find out what it is. Same thing with golf courses. We have monitoring wells and sites, both surface and groundwater, in and around golf courses. And those golf courses are permitted to use specific products, and those are the products that we look for in and around those golf courses. But if something else were to show up in that water, we would see it, because the instrument we're using is it takes a snapshot of all of the molecular weights that are in that water. And how we identify those compounds is by the retention time and molecular weight. We can take you to the lab and give you a lesson in the time of flight instrumentation that we have.
Thank you. And one more follow-up. So I'm trying to hew to the notion of a high-level policy that wants to reduce toxic exposures to every living thing that's out there. And I think we've talked about Department of Public Health, so we're looking at human health impacts for the many other living things out there: flora, fauna, soils, microflora, microfauna. Does this program allow us to assess and monitor and minimize negative impacts to all those other living things where these chemicals may end up being introduced?
Senator, yes, it does. And we're getting a little bit nuanced, but specifically in our permitted programs, like if we're looking for golf course pesticides, in the permit itself, it has a maximum allowable concentration. There is one number that the health department's generated and one number that DEC has generated, and that's either an HAL, a health advisory level, or a MAC, a maximum allowable concentration. So those are both used in the golf course permit program, and we're always comparing to both. The sort of standard for aquatic toxicity is the sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but I can't think of the term. But we do look at both numbers when we're making decisions. And when Steve was mentioning that we didn't have any exceedances, those are both of human health and the aquatic life criteria as well.
Thank you.
Mhm. I think, sorry to jump in again. I think we should invite the natural resources committees in when we give these presentations to the ag committees on our findings of surface, on our monitoring water, our monitoring programs findings. We do that for both Senate and House Agriculture at least once a session. And it might be appropriate to invite the natural resources committees as well. We do a deep dive.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think, for instance, everyone's familiar with the movement of phosphorus from ag property, ag land into public waters. And which is why we've got this ongoing challenge with phosphorus in levels. And I don't have I think you have the science, I don't, to say that phosphorus is not the only thing leaving. And so then that begs the question, what other chemicals are leaving and what are their impacts once they arrive, in waters of the state? And whether it's groundwater, surface water, I think that's part of the number of problems we've run into with the introduction of chemicals, some of which are economic poisons, into the environment at large, is, I think, in the background of trying to look at this. We have a high-level policy in the state, and I think the struggle I'm having looking at this rule and hearing testimony over the last several weeks is, is this rule represent an adequate answer to the policy goal of managing those at safe levels?
Okay, thank you for the question. So there are multiple facets to answer that question. One is all the pesticide use strategies that we are advocating for the pesticide users is use integrated pest management. So you're not using pesticides as a prophylactic treatment, for example, or applying on a schedule. You're using the pesticides you need when you need them based on monitoring of the population of pests that you're trying to control, and at a level that's economically significant. So that's integrated pest management. This rule does emphasize that both for the permits and for the certification of training, which is one of the things we need to do to bring that into the 21st century. All our training needs to emphasize to pesticide users that they need to use integrated pest management principles. And a lot of them already are based on the training they've received, over the last few decades. But, so that's part of the issue of reducing, or the goal of reducing pesticide use or pesticide impacts, is to only use pesticides when they're needed. And, we need to keep in mind here, we're talking about people don't use pesticides because they like to use pesticides. They use pesticides because they got a pest problem. They're trying to save a crop, or they're eliminating a pest problem in a home, or whatever they're doing. Pesticides they're a tool. They have to be used properly. That's where integrated pest management comes in. Then we've got the other side of the environmental monitoring, just to make sure there's not some characteristic of the product that's causing an environmental problem. Now, that's always an emerging thing. We're always learning more and doing more. And like Carrie said, I've been impressed since I got here, the latitude we have, the authority we have to do that. And so we can do that. And as new products come on, the other thing that happens in the industry is new products are constantly being introduced. They're all evaluated for environmental impacts by EPA. And we look at that too. If it's a new product, we're going to look at the data. We don't have a toxicologist right now on staff, but we have enough experience to read the reports and see what the issues are, and respond appropriately. In the event that there's an emerging contaminant issue, we have the resources to go out and look for it. And coming from Florida, I did that for 30 years. We do that when a new product comes along. If there's a potential environmental issue, we evaluate it, first of all, and maybe not even allow its use. And that's been done plenty of times in a lot of states, because we can be more stringent than the federal government. The next step would be to evaluate if there are any impacts from the use of the product, if it's being used the way it's supposed to be used. You always have the potential for somebody to misuse a product and cause a problem, but we certainly have the tools to deal with that. We're doing inspections, investigations, take enforcement action. So we have all these tools at our disposal to evaluate impacts of products. But especially for us, we always have to balance what the use of that product is. Why are people using it? What are they attempting to accomplish? So if you look at the way EPA evaluates pesticides, they do an evaluation of the risks versus the benefits. So if the risks are too high, the benefits don't matter. If you want low risk and high benefit, and that's what the whole purpose of the regulatory program is. We also always have the backstop of the pesticide label. So whatever's in the permit, whatever in the rule, the pesticide label itself is the final backstop for properly using a product. We can require additional language on labels in Vermont. We just recently rejected several products because they didn't have the labeling that we want. It had to do with pesticide container disposal, but they didn't have the right language on it. So we said, sorry, we're not going to register your product. So, but anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
Sure. Well, one just very quick clarifying question. When you say pesticide, does this also involve, are you covering herbicides?
Yeah. Pesticide is any material. It could be a herbicide, a fungicide, insecticide, rodenticide, whatever it is. Yeah. Pesticides are all those materials.
I believe Senator McDonald had a comment. Or not.
I'm stuck here because if the feds tell us we shouldn't do something or it should be outlawed, why are we talking about our ability to balance the policy issues? I mean,
if the federal government has prohibited use, it's over. That's not an issue.
Do the rules direct the agency to sit down and balance things, or is that a legislative?
That is the evaluation that the US EPA uses when they're registering products. And we have the ability to go beyond that.
I guess my question is, do you have I've already asked, the authority to not go that far?
I'm not sure I understand the question, sir.
Wait, beyond, as opposed to?
We never be less stringent than the federal government. We'll always be more stringent. As stringent or more stringent as the federal government.
All set?
I was looking at section 2, powers of the secretary, 2.02, 2.03, and 2.04, where secretary finds that the public health and safety and welfare emergency action, et cetera, may do something. 203, any person aggrieved by the decision of the secretary may request a hearing within 15 days to can the hearing result in the secretary changing the secretary's decision?
Senator, these are specific to the enforcement process if there is a license, a certificate, or a permit. And that is the gist of this rule, making sure that certification and training is up to par and that we're maintaining all that the state can while being as stringent, at least as much or more so than the EPA. But for the powers of the secretary, these do derive from statute under Chapter 87, and these are with regard to our enforcement process. as it pertains to the denial, amendment, suspension, or revocation of licenses, certificates, or permits. I think you might be interested in the language that is found under section 4.03, state prohibited pesticides, subsection A and B. And if you go to that, now we're talking about what happens when a product is entering the streams, channels of commerce through distribution, sale, or use, and what happens if it's been canceled or suspended by the EPA or the agency. Specifically under subsection B, the agency may add additional restrictions to the conditions, distribution, sale, or use of pesticides provided for the disposition of existing stocks. So that goes back to that existing stocks language, but I think that does prove that the state, through the Agency of Agriculture as a co-regulator with the EPA, does have the ability to be as much or more stringent than the EPA.
So you're saying when it comes to being stricter than the EPA, the secretary has authority, but 403 says when the feds say no, the answer is no. Yeah. Thank you.
I think Mr. Carpenter had his hand up.
Yes.
And then Carrie, I'll come back to you.
Well, I was just going to, going back to Senator Bray's line of discussion with the agency, with the AFM. I know I've discussed it with a few members at this table that highlights the needed involvement of other agencies in this. We've always maintained that the Agency of Agriculture should be responsible. It comes off the farm field because responsibility of the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Health. Because suddenly it's not an ag issue, just an ag issue anymore. It's a public health issue. It's natural resources and environment issue. This gets back to more extensive monitoring by other agencies. As Senator Lyons said, more involvement by the Department of Health under an MOU. And this is, of course, all high-level policy discussion that obviously really isn't in this rule. But one agency who's responsible for just agriculture, monitoring all the pesticides and their public health impacts, doesn't seem to make sense when you have much broader interest from the public on the impacts of pesticides on people. Suddenly you need other agencies involved, other eyes on the issue. And EPA, we can get into debates on whether or not the EPA is good at setting the floor, but that's certainly the floor. The state has the authority, as we've been going back and forth, to set the standard higher. And the question is, in some areas of this rule, and whether the agency sets that standard high enough, and whether the Department of Health and the Agency of Natural Resources would agree with that. So, I mean, it gets back to the issue we had, the discussion we had under the Vermont water quality standards about monitoring of pesticides by that agency and surface waters and drinking water sources to have an extra set of eyes on the issue, so it's not all residing within one agency.
Carrie?
I just wanted to give an example to Senator McDonald to help clarify. So DDT is banned nationally. If we decided in Vermont that we needed it to control a bed bug outbreak, we could not do that. We can't bring back DDT. We can't bring back the organochlorine, chloridane, all those canceled pesticides. There are folks in Vermont that would love to have them back. We can't offer them for folks to use in the state. And you highlighted May, the Secretary May, under powers of the Secretary, and I just wanted to add that it's important that the agency maintain prosecutorial discretion in some instances. And the example I had for that is when COVID first hit, and all of our breweries that weren't selling alcohol over the shelf for people to consume anymore started pumping out hand sanitizer. If we were to enforce the full rule, they were actually manufacturing and producing insecticide or pesticides. We would have had to close all of those facilities down that were making sanitizers if we were to hold the rule as it lies. So there is some prosecutorial discretion in there, and it's important for situations like that. It doesn't happen often, but if we were to uphold that rule, we would have had to close down all those breweries pumping out the sanitizers for COVID, made them become pesticide producing establishments and report their production and label their products appropriately. We had that discussion internally and with the governor's office and felt that wouldn't have been an appropriate route.
Thank you. I'd like to say,
I also wanted to add here that the health department does calculate health advisory levels for any pesticide that we ask for, and those are posted on their website. And most of the chemicals that have health advisories on the health department's website are pesticides, and we do use those for evaluation of our surface and groundwater data. So health department has an intersect. It's just not on the policy side. We use the health department to evaluate and develop exposure levels for us, just as they do for PFAS with the Department of Environmental Conservation. Same folks, same toxicologist creates those values for DEC, and they create them for us as well.
Thank you.
we're at 11:30. I'm a little sensitive to time because we do have a few other things on our agenda, but I want to make sure that we have the conversation we need to have. Any more questions or comments, or where does the committee want to go?
I will certainly move this along by asking that we approve with the current changes from DEC 22 P06. Motion.
I think we should be clear about, because there have been 3 rounds of changes, and I think they all are intended to be included by AAFM. So I think we just need to be clear in the motion that it's with the changes that were proposed on November 23rd, November 29th, and December 13th. That is what the agency is still proposing.
What agency is it?
Senator Bray.
Well, with my partner, Representative Hickley here, I suppose I would like to hear from we can hear from the committee in the form of voting on something. I would offer a substitute motion to postpone action to the next meeting. And the reason is I feel like we're once again in the unenviable position of receiving a lot of information close to a meeting date. I'm not, for myself, I wouldn't be able to, in good faith, vote to approve this rule now because I'm between conflicting impressions of what the adequacy of the rule to achieve policy goals, et cetera, or the process for where we've arrived at. I would want to be able to do more research prior to a subsequent meeting so that we could hash that out. And I would encourage parties who have criticisms of the rule to provide a revised assessment of the rule as it's now being offered, in the 3 different parts, November 23rd, November 29th, December 13th, so that we'll be in a more informed position to address things like legislative intent and arbitrariness, which remain concerns for me. And I'd like to be able to vote with adequate information in front of every member of the committee and ask. So that'd be the motion to postpone action. Substitute motion to postpone action to the next meeting of this committee, whatever date that is.
Representative Watkins.
I've been flying blind here completely today because I've been away, traveled to a board retreat, traveled home yesterday, got home last night. I haven't read anything that came in the last 4 days because I've had absolutely not a minute to do it. So I've been sitting here trying to take in what I can, but feeling like I'm flying blind, even though I read everything that came before that. And so I definitely support that motion because I really am feeling like my sense is that the rule likely meets legislative intent. My sense is also that we're still putting, way too much pesticides into the ground in Vermont. But that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether it meets the rule. But I also want to be thinking about how to frame a letter when the time comes that we vote on this rule to the committees and think carefully about, I'm still like the treated seed issue. I haven't even really talked about it. But again, I'm just flying blind because I've had zero time to read anything that's come in the last 4 days. And so I would like very much to, if we can get permission to do it, the agency to delay this till the next meeting.
Representative Higley.
Mr. Chair, if I can just advocate a little bit for my motion. Again, I think I've heard from the agency that, it looks like there's even new EPA standards coming down for certain things. They do have the process for additional rulemaking. They said that they're going to do that. So again, to prolong this at this point, to me is not fair in a sense, as well as, all the last minute testimony that came in. It is, some of it is concerning to me. I think it can be addressed and should be addressed. But again, for the work that the agency has done and what I've heard today, I again advocate for the motion to move this along.
Go to Anthea real quick.
So just from a process perspective, and the chart on the back of your agenda has not been updated, and apologies there. You have gotten a series of extensions from the agency for your 45-day review period. So once that 45 days is up, the agency can move forward without regard to the fact that you have sought to postpone action for your own purposes. So if you are going to postpone, you're going to need to get permission from them. Otherwise, you could postpone and you could take action at the next meeting, and they may have just gone and adopted the rule already, which they're allowed to do under the APA. So you might want to ask that question first. And then for purposes of what AAFM would need to do in terms of actually getting the rule adopted, by you getting an extension from them, your rules do extend their 8-month adoption deadline by the same number of days, but they are butting up against their November 18th adoption deadline. So they're, again, a position where you were in at your last meeting where you can't postpone your own action unless they say you can, because you have now run out of time on your 45 days.
Senator McDonald.
I'm much more, I feel much more comfortable with the rules that have been proposed than I was 2 weeks ago. And we've heard from the agency on why they made the changes that they made. And we've had people that have been critical of the rules that were put forth before. And I think what Senator Bray has asked us to do is to take the time to listen to the people that were critical before, members of the public that come in and tell us whether they still have problems or they too are satisfied before we vote on this. That would be my preference. I don't know if we ask the agency for a couple more days. If we were, if there were no strong objections that had merit that came up by those who had been critical, then I'm prepared to go ahead and vote for it. But those folks haven't had a chance to react to what we've had presented to us today. Over.
Thank you, members of LCAR. Before getting to that, I just wanted to respond to Representative Baumgart's if possible, as you're walking. Just that the last 4 days, as far as a catch-up, we're all, I think, covered with our beginning testimony as well as Director Redmond's testimony, where it was two agencies coming to an agreement on language in an already well-established rule, both of these rules being very well-established, and maintaining consistency for the betterment of the state and its constituents. So that's just a quick catch-up, but I understand The agency is not prepared to give you an extension at this moment. I can take this back to the Secretary of Agriculture and can provide you with an answer shortly, but at this moment, the agency is unable to grant an extension right now.
Senator Benning.
I was prepared to extend it last time around because DEC came. I had understood that that was the primary reason you were moving to have that extension. I'm hearing from DEC now that they are fine with the rule as proposed. I'm hearing bits and pieces of shortcomings about policy, in my humble opinion, not about the process or the procedures that led to them bringing us this rule. There are probably a gazillion different policy questions being raised here, but that's not for us to decide. We can't, through LCAR, anticipate that this agency is going to require another agency to participate in the monitoring process, for instance. That's a policy question. I am really reluctant at this point in time to drag this out for yet another period of unknown time when it's become pretty clear to me that the committees of jurisdiction have some homework that they've got to do to address the policy shortcomings. It's just my 2 cents, so I'm in favor of Mark's original proposal.
Senator Bray.
Yeah, so I take your point that we did hear from DEC, which was helpful, and that was, and I think really what I'm asking for is another round of another opportunity timing wise. But I would say if we move in this direction, that I would ask all interested parties to engage in a very candid speak now or forever hold your peace sort of disclosure, because part of where I'm anticipating we go is that we end up with an approval of the rule and a letter to committees of jurisdiction. And that what I would like us to be able to do, if that's the way we go, is to deliver a letter that is adequately informed to lay out some of the, whatever we call it, shortcomings of this rule. So I know that there, Representative Higley and I were talking before the meeting started this morning about will there be legislative work to follow? My guess is yes, but I would feel like we finished our job if we could write a more informed letter to the committees of jurisdiction, as opposed to say, we ran into issues on this bill, we couldn't resolve them, we approved the rule anyway, and we suggest, it sounds a little glib, but we suggest you look into this. And I feel like we delivered on our duties a little more solidly if we end up approving, also lay out some of the challenges in letters to committees of jurisdiction, as well as the Senator Lyons Committee, which has an interest but wasn't a committee of jurisdiction for reviewing the rule.
Anthea?
So just 2 things to add there. Your 45-day review period now extended. That's the window with which you could object. You do not have to approve today. You could let the agency go and adopt the rule. It sounds like that's probably what they would do. You could never approve, but the approval piece is LCAR's mark of saying, agency, you can go forward. We are not going to avail ourselves of that opportunity to object and then certify our objection. The other thing I would point out is when you send your letters to the committees of jurisdiction, you're doing it under 3 VSA 817E. And that says at any time following its consideration of a final proposal under section 841 of this title, the committee by majority vote of the entire committee may request that any standing committees of the General Assembly review the issues or questions presented therein, which are outside the jurisdiction of the committee, but are within the jurisdictional review of those standing committees. So today is not your last opportunity to work on give me direction and then approve a letter to the committees of jurisdiction. You could still offer an opportunity for parties that are interested to help you craft a letter at a future meeting without getting this extension from the agency to do that. So your opportunity to send letters to committees of jurisdiction does not close today if you approve the rule. And if you choose not to approve the rule today, do not get the extension from AAFM, they are still going to be able to move forward to adopt even if you didn't approve the rule.
Okay.
LCAR does historically either approve or reject.
So if they fail to give us an extension and then the rule goes into effect.
Well, if they don't give you an extension, they can still move forward and adopt the rule.
Okay.
They need to do that by the 18th.
Okay. And if they do that, does that burden of proof shift because it's now enacting a rule unapproved by LCAR?
No. So what shifts the burden of proof is if LCAR objects. LCAR could choose never to approve a rule. But if LCAR approves a rule on like day 14, then the agency can go and adopt the rule on day 15. It doesn't have to wait for that 45-day window to lapse before moving forward with adoption. And part of that, the reason why the APA has that 45 days and then the agency can move forward is so you don't get into a position where LCAR just delays, and the agency can never move forward and adopt the rule.
Thank you.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you. This is all, this happens to us so many times, and I appreciate, especially Anthea, your comments on how we can proceed. I think there's enough here and heard from committee members who would like a little more time that we should probably give ourselves a little more time. But just a comment, it would be extremely helpful as we're putting together a letter to policy committees to have a collaborative process with not just the advocates who are out there, but also with the agencies, because certainly there are issues around resources that preclude AAFM or ANR or the DOH from actually completing the work that's necessary, that we feel is necessary. So just a comment. Thank you. That's it.
Senator McDonald.
I applaud the agency on coming in today with the changes that they have brought forth, and look forward to approving the rule at the next time we meet. But giving the public the opportunity to look at what's proposed, and expect that maybe no one will show up because there's as pleased with it as you are. So that would be the collaborative way to move forward, and I trust the agency will make the right choice should we move to consider it 2 weeks from now. So, thank you.
Representative Hinckley.
Mr. Chair, I hate to prolong this, but again, I guess a concern that I have is, and maybe this should come from the agency, but if this is going to open up a public process again, how is that going to be constructed? I mean, the certain advocates now that have already, submitted their testimony, which we have, we've seen it. That's what we could possibly go on. But is it fair, or how is it that the rest of the public is going to know that there's still an opportunity for testimony? I mean,
And it'll be on your agenda if you put it on your agenda. I mean, that's a way that the public will know about it. You certainly could reach out to people. You're talking now. It's live for the world to hear if you're inviting people to come in and testify in this rule next time. Obviously, your chair or the vice chair standing in the chair's place, set the agenda with Charlene. We'll put what you want on the agenda, and then committee members can put things on the agenda through your own alternate rules.
but that's through our agenda, I guess,
Well, I if I may, I suspect that all stakeholders that have vested interest in this conversation are already plugged into this conversation. So I don't think there's going to be new people coming into the conversation. That would be my assessment of it. Senator Benning.
I'm not going to be here when you come back, but I'm going to suggest what you're about to do is establishing a precedent that could be disastrous. We are not the first jurisdiction for this discussion. The agencies take testimony, they have public comment. LCAR goes through the process. we've now gone through this process 3 times. The only snafu that we had the last time, as I understood it, was DEC was weighing in at the last moment. We've heard that get corrected. You're now inviting a completely new process. I want to say, I believe you, Trevor, that nobody's going to come back and re-up. I've been in here for 12 years now. They will come back and they will try to reopen and bring up issues that haven't yet been discussed. I'm hearing at the same time the agency is understanding that there are additional things that may need to be addressed, and this is not the end all of this rulemaking process. But to reopen this literally for anyone and everyone to come back and weigh in is an invitation for people who are not happy about the policy questions that haven't been dealt with. And that's where I get really nervous. I don't know that, Anthea, you're in a position right now to draft letters to the committees of jurisdiction based on what you've heard. I've heard enough to understand that we have crossed what was necessary to cross the T's and dot the I's, at least as far as DEC was concerned. But you're placing an open invitation for people to come back and reopen this in a way that could cause a lot more problems than you anticipate. I'll stick with my original vote and say that's the way I'm going to leave it.
Senator McDonald.
This committee's job is to be open to people coming in and giving us positions. And we're not reopening anything. Thanks to the agency, they've answered a bunch of questions that were asked previously. They've made suggestions that most folks here seem prepared to endorse. But we are here to listen to people tell us what is wrong about something. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them. If there are changes that we think ought to be made in the months to come, we will send letters to the committees of jurisdiction. But in the many years I've served on LCAR, which is over a couple of decades, the system is designed to get everybody into the table and come out with a product that is not always perfect, but we all agree with. And I trust that the agency will come back and say their product is good enough to pass scrutiny on anyone that comes in to bring up objections, and that 2 weeks from now we'll be prepared to sign on the dotted line. So I support the motion by Senator Bray. The substitute by Senator Bray. Thank you.
Is all done with comments?
I'll just say that I think, I very largely agree with Senator Benning about the need to separate the job in front of us and the job in front of the agency and policy. And they're different things. I'm still at the point of trying to parse that and understand where those lines are. And by the way, one thing I should have led with my first set of comments is that I really appreciate the work of the agency and DEC. And I think it's far ahead of where it was, and I have every sense it meets the intent. But I would love to have the couple of weeks just to be able to spend the time at home reading, frankly, that I didn't have this time. And to really use the opportunity of the next time, mostly I believe, to help us craft the right letter and think through what's actually in this rule. I am curious about what could be in this rule that isn't in this rule. How, what the legitimacy of the claim that it's kind of the bare minimum to meet. I don't have an opinion about that yet because I don't know. But I'd love to have the time to really do my homework. And so it's not about, but anyway, I'd love to have the time to do that homework. I absolutely understand the point that Senator Benning is making, that there's a difference between the rule, the requirement of the rule, and future public policy. And I just want to be able to parse those and understand the difference before we go forward. So it would be a real, I want a good letter out of this process.
Okay, thank you. Senator Bray.
Really, very briefly. So I've been remiss. I've thought of it several times, but not said it. So I want to make sure that Agency of Agriculture, Agency of Natural Resources, knows that this is, I hope, a sort of a productive inquiry. I'm appreciative of all the work that's been done. And this is, but we are talking about the use of poisons. The title, economic poisons. It's they are toxic, and I'm not going to apologize for leaning in carefully to trying to make sure that we are as protective as possible. Yes, we authorize their use, we recognize their value, but I have no apologies about wanting to make sure that we are as clear as possible about minimizing negative impacts on the health and well-being of everything that lives in the state of Vermont. And so I'm appreciative that people are trying to help us get to a better letter, probably approving a rule. But the environment doesn't get to speak up in the committee very often. And I just feel like it's an important time to say, all right, let's err on the side of caution a little bit and acknowledge that it's a step in the right direction and that there's more work to do. And it's the more work to do piece that I think a letter could help specify to everyone's benefit. I'm sure that you all, by virtue of your work implementing this rule, know about things you would like to be able to do, or things that are unsettled, or things that are pending. And it could be helpful if you help us articulate those issues in a way that helps us write a better letter and helps initiate follow-on processes that are outside the rulemaking proper. So I say thank you in advance.
Anthea, point of clarification. The agencies needs to check in to see if they want to extend that. It puts us outside of our meeting in terms of a response. And what does that procedurally or process-wise do for us in terms of, let's say they do give us an extension, but then there's an adoption issue too. And can we address those outside of a committee meeting?
So LCAR's rules say that a proportionate extension will be granted automatically to an agency unable to meet the 8-month deadline because it granted the committee a waiver of the review period. So if AFM comes back and says to Charlene, hey, we'll give LCAR an additional 14 days, take them to their next meeting on December 29th. Charlene will send them that form to sign. That gets sent to the Secretary of State's office. That then would proportionately extend their 8-month adoption deadline from December 18th to 2 weeks after December 18th. And they would need to adopt the rule by then, and it could go into effect 15 days after that or at a later time that's specified.
So it's part of the same process.
Yeah. But what I want to make sure that the committee understands is if you leave here today without hearing back from AFM about that 14-day extension, you could be in a position where 2 weeks from now, there's no point in approving and you no longer could object to the rule. You could still send the letter, but AFM may have just gone ahead and adopted the rule. Your next meeting is after December 29th. So if they don't adopt the rule by the 18th, you're going to be hearing from them that they then want the extension on the 8-month adoption deadline. So I think you probably will need to hear from AFM very, very soon as we are getting close to the 18th as to whether or not they're giving you that 2-week extension to the 29th.
Given what's in front of us right now, I get confused about the motions and how we're going to do the votes. I want to get it right.
So I think the way that you did it last time was you voted to substitute Senator Bray's motion for Representative Higley's motion, and then after you, in that instance, voted to substitute, you then voted on Senator Bray's motion. So step one will be to vote on whether or not you want to substitute, and then we can deal with step two if you choose that you want to substitute, because if you choose not to substitute, you'll be voting on Representative Higley's motion, and if you choose to substitute, you'll be voting on Senator Bray's motion.
It'll end up being a vote on, it might end up being a vote on Representative Higley's motion as substituted for.
And I will always say you need to talk to Secretary Bloomer and Clerk Ask for all of your parliamentary procedure.
So we're on the substitute motion, and you want to repeat that?
Sure. So that I move to substitute a motion to postpone action to the next meeting of LCAR on Rule 22P06.
Additional discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Raise your hand. Those opposed?
No.
2. Motion passes.
It's been substituted for.
And now we're voting on the substitution motion.
That was I from me, sorry.
I'm sorry?
I think Rep. Odie is here.
We're now going to vote on them.
Yeah, but that was I from me, sorry.
Now we're voting on the substitute motion.
Yes.
Any additional discussion? Senator Brennan?
I just want to put my rationale for voting no. I was so hoping to leave here with a positive vote. I come from the trial court system, and when a judge says you shall have your evidence presented by a given point in time, if you're not there with your evidence, you're out of luck. I appreciate the fact that this world is constantly changing, and there are new products coming down every day in which this rule is going to have to constantly adjust to. But my sense tells me that the procedure in this rule enables the agencies to do just that. I am very concerned when I hear we're going to open it up for new testimony, because that invites people to come in and air grievances and present twists in a way that we've already heard that. I am very much concerned that I'm hearing the agencies, EEC, say they are satisfied with the rule as it is, with the understanding that as new products come down the pike, there is a requirement for them to respond accordingly. What I'm hearing are shortcomings about policy questions, and I'm not sure how much we're going to get by way of policy direction if a new set of evidence comes in the door. So I'll leave it at that and say, hey, there goes my hope of leaving the building with a positive vote.
Well, we haven't adjourned yet. So.
True.
Okay, all those in favor of substitute motion offered by Senator Bray, please say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. Substitute motion passes.
That was I from me also.
Who's that?
Rep. Odie.
Sorry about that. Representative Higley.
Mr. Chair, I have a 12 o'clock meeting. It's close by, so I could make it there. And it looks like if I left, there would be a quorum. And I just want to make sure that that's the case. If Senator Lyons and Representative Odie are still going to be here, I believe that.
We would have a quorum, yes.
So I will.
I'm in the same boat.
I have my hand up.
Mr.
Mr. Chair, I do have a meeting. I can stay for a couple more minutes, but I'm going to be shifting over to another meeting. So hopefully we can have a quick conversation. I know there are witnesses on the agenda, but this is unavoidable. I thought we had 10 to 12, and so I scheduled something in at 12:15, and I'm like to walk around and take a little break.
Okay. Okay. I want to say thanks to folks that have been involved in this lengthy conversation. Yes, for Bray.
So again, I want to say thank you to Agency of Agriculture, A&R, the group of people that have raised concerns. And, so to the point of, I hope that we have no, I don't know, power to compel anyone to do anything on terms of responding, I'm guessing, but I would hope that in terms of addressing the rule, that we could hear from proponents and opponents in a timely way, like not less than like maybe 5 days prior to the next meeting, so that we could have some sorting out conversation prior to the meeting, as opposed to having to always do it in LCAR, which is pretty awkward for everyone. So I know there's holidays, and I don't mean to be like the Grinch ruining people's holidays, but I hope that we can get some timely reassessment. And the other thing too, on the positive side, is we've talked about stuff that parties are aware of, but not addressed. And if that could be included as well, it could be useful guidance to committees of jurisdiction, because you all know better than anyone else what's in the rule versus quote unquote missing from the rule. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carpenter?
Just a question, Mr. Chairman. Does the committee intend to meet on December the 29th?
I don't think so, but we haven't had that conversation yet.
Okay, because that's obviously.
It may be January 5th, yeah.
Would tie into when we would get our comments to the committee. Okay, well, I'm going to stay and listen, so I'm sure we'll decide.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
And you'll have that conversation and let us know whether you want to extend it.
So the request is going to be until January.
Sorry?
So LCAR would be seeking a 21-day extension to get to January. I'm putting an email, this is an email.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, members.
Thank you.
And happy holidays.
So Representative Higley, feel free.
Okay, good. It looks like even with the three of us on their spot.
Well, the question is, can Representative Odie stay?
Well, here's, we're already past 12, okay? And-
Yes, I can, if you want to know.
And on the agenda is a review of a transitional housing program emergency rules. And Senator Lyons has to leave and needs a little time to walk around, as she said, before she goes to her next meeting. I'm not sure we have enough time to have this conversation and give it its due. That's my concern. Can we just push this to the next meeting?
Yeah, you can postpone.
So we're not postponing action, really? We're just,
So
I mean, how does that work?
that's a good point, because you're not taking it up, so you're not really postponing. We can just indicate
Support for
in.
NPR comes from NPR
Just a
stations.
second.
Other contributors include Charles Schwab, dedicated to serving clients.
Wall Street.
We'll indicate in.
Senator Lyons is an external
Can you-
transmission.
Can you please repeat the question, because I'm getting preoccupied, as you can tell.
We'll indicate in the minutes that the last three items were pushed to your meeting on January 5th, and we'll make sure that Charlene gets the agenda posted sooner rather than later, so that people who would like to know what LCAR is taking up will have.
Yeah, and the reason I'm thinking.
Motion to adjourn be in order.
1 second. We were scheduled to meet on the 29th. That's between Christmas, New Year's. I don't think it makes sense for us to try to do something like that. The new schedule that Charlene had sent out for our discussion called for the first meeting to be January 5th. We're not deciding what that schedule is going to be. We're not signing off on it, but I suggest if people are okay with that, that we'll plan on meeting on January 5th. Senator Petty.
Works for me. I'm going to submit a resignation letter to try to get the Committee on Committees to appoint somebody for that meeting.
Okay.
So I will say, and this bothers me about the statute, is that you are appointed, composed of 8 members of the General Assembly, to be appointed for 2-year terms ending on February 1 of odd number of years, which would have people like Senator Benning be in a position where they are on the committee, the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, despite the fact that they are no longer a legislator. So
yeah.
That is why.
Speaking of policy decisions that need to be directed to the Committee of Jurisdiction.
Send a memo to GovOps on that one.
Your battle here is with with Judge Giron.
Who's going to win?
Okay, Senator Bray.
Senator Benning, would you like to do the honors? Then you can go out with.
Doesn't like to have an adjournment motion, but in spite of that, I'll move that we adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
There.
You got
And I will note that you adjourned at
You got to go
12:07.
out on a winning motion. That's what I was trying to get to.
There you go.
What?
The part of Linda Myers will be played tonight by Joseph Benning.
I've been told that.
Hey, everybody. Yeah. See ya.
Thank you, sir.
See ya, right?
Yeah, the housing
I
district.
feel like that scum. I didn't.
Well, hey, I